Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. It's entitled Hot Takes on Design System Trends, where the Zero Height team is going to share some spicy takes on all things design systems. Hopefully, they're not too bland, but we're also really excited to hear a bit of the questions that you have, some of the hot takes that you might have that we might disagree with, and all of that. Before we get started, there are a couple of housekeeping things that I wanted to take an opportunity to go through. The first is that if you are not a part of our Slack channel, Zeros, make sure that you join. Over there, you can continue the conversation that we started here in today's webinar. You will be the first to know about some of our product announcements, and it's certainly the best way to ask questions or share insight with the entire Zero Height team. If you need assistance at any point during today's webinar, you can mention Connie Greasley, who will be hanging out over in the chat. She can help with technical questions, all that jazz that you might need some help with. You'll also notice right below my face, there is a cool little button that allows you to join our Slack community. So if you are interested in joining, hit the button that says sign up here. You'll be taken to a place where you can get going with everything Zeros. The big question of webinars is always, are you recording this? And I am happy to share that we are. So you are actually being recorded right now, actually not your face, but mine. But nonetheless, once this is over, you'll receive a shiny email with the recording that you can watch over and over again. You can share it with your friend, your mom, anybody else who might be interested in some hot takes on design systems. And the last little bit of housekeeping is a bit of an apology. Unfortunately, the webinar platform that we're using today, which is called Demio, does not have live captioning, but we do want to make sure that this is accessible to as many folks as humanly possible. So if you would like to enable captioning, we recommend webcaptioner.com. A quick note, if you are going to use Web Captioner, make sure that you are listening to the webinar through your computer speakers versus your headphones in order to get the best experience possible. So be sure to head over if you'd like to have some captioning. And lastly, we do have a code of conduct here that is relatively short. Don't be a jerk. If you have to question it, then maybe don't say it. But we certainly would like to facilitate lots and lots of conversation and hear tons of perspectives about design systems, everything happening in your organizations, and lots of things in between. Also want to share a quick plug for some of the upcoming events that we have. Next Tuesday, we are running a webinar called Community Driven Design Systems. So certainly be sure to sign up for that one. You'll see a button again below my face that says register now if you're interested in taking a look at that one. You also would love to join us at Converge in Manchester on September 21st. If you are around the UK or you fancy taking a trip, come join us. Amy Hube, Gina Ann, Michelle's going to be speaking. There's a lot going on and you don't want to miss it. Again, as has become a trend, below my face, you'll see a button that says find out more. You can go there, see some of the talks, everything that you need to know about Converge in Manchester. And finally, if you are going to be in Copenhagen, the Zero Height team will be at Design Matters. Come through, check us out, get some cool zippy swag, hear more hot takes about design systems. We'd be so excited to meet you there. All right, without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce you to the speakers today. My name is Neff. I am the product marketing manager at Zero Height, and I'll let everybody else introduce themselves by telling us what they do here at Zero Height, where they're located, and a fun fact. Michelle, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I'm Michelle Chin, even though it says Team Zero Height. I'm a design advocate at Zero Height, which means that I was a product designer and design ops manager in my former life, but now I work with our customers with their design system challenges and needs. I look at current trends, and I also do a little digging and host community events to foster a design system community and share best practices.
Rosie, you're up.
Lovely. I'm Rosie Watson. I'm a product engineer at Zero Height, and that essentially just means that I'm a software engineer that cares a lot more about our users than others. So sort of working on a team that's looked at how we can make the product fit better for developers over the past year, and also working internally on our own design system that we're starting again from scratch, which I'm sure will be an interesting topic. I see Michelle skipped the fun fact, but I will give you one. Back in 2020, I was the biggest purchaser of wholemeal bagels in my local Sainsbury's, which is a supermarket for all of you that aren't from England. Which I was quite proud of. I used to eat 2 wholemeal bagels a day, and so did my partner, which meant we would go through a packet every day. So that very quickly added up. Yeah.
That is incredible. I feel like they need stock in you, certainly, in terms of how you're going to be able to keep that Sainsbury's afloat. Rob, we'll kick it over to you.
Hey everyone, so I'm Rob, a senior product designer at zeroheight. Work quite closely with Rosie actually. We're on the same product squad, and also working on the kind of rebuild of our design system as well, as we try and bring some of the best practices we've learned from researching and talking to our users, and sort of stealing the best ideas, I guess. But yeah, otherwise, doing everything that you would expect a product designer to do, from kind of initial exploratory discovery research through to actually figuring out how things are going to work and working with our developers to actually make those things real and release them to the folks who are using zeroheight. And I guess for a fun fact, I like to think that I honed my user research capabilities by working as a freelance music journalist. Back in my early career, I sort of did that on the side as a bit of an evening job, and it was a great way to practice the research skills when I wasn't able to do a lot of research in my kind of like early career, which meant I think I did a lot of very awkward music interviews because I was doing a lot of just sort of like very quiet, letting them speak, and I feel like a lot of people weren't kind of used to that when I was running interviews, but I think it helped make me the kind of researcher I am today, so it's always quite fun.
That's amazing. We'll start with a relatively easy kickoff question. What are most people talking about regarding design systems? Rosie, we'll start with you.
Amazing. That means I get to pick the easy answer, which I think is tokens. I think it's very much the hot topic of the moment. I don't think it's a new concept, which I think is more of the sort of hot take style on it. I think it's something that's existed for a very long time in design systems, and it's more that it's sort of bubbled to the surface, probably alongside some of the other parts that are happening around sort of more interaction between developers and designers, which I think has sort of made tokens the real hot topic of the moment, and something that I think we're going to continue to hear a lot about for quite a while.
Certainly. Michelle, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I definitely agree. There's a lot of talk around tokens and exploration around tokens. I think people are definitely interested, but there's like a challenge of figuring out how to structure tokens. I feel like that can lead to a lot of like, I guess like, I don't know, analysis paralysis almost. So I think that's kind of where a lot of teams are, where they want to, but they're not really sure. And I think also it just seems very, very permanent, right? Like sticking a stake in the ground saying we're gonna architect tokens this way and not sure if it's like gonna be the right way.
Totally.
Yeah. I definitely think in terms of like the architecting, I think it's probably the biggest blocker for people jumping into it. And I think that's why there's been so much discussion around how they're implemented, and, sort of with the W3C draft coming in and people thinking it's a cool idea, but it maybe not being the easiest thing to adopt, both from like people making the design systems and the tools that are trying to integrate with them. And I think that's probably why there's more talk about it, because it's not super easy to just jump straight into.
Yeah, there's been definitely, I think, from the design standpoint, a lot of questions about, sort of pre-config, when were Figma going to actually do something around this? And I think that has held a lot of teams back, particularly because a lot of teams don't want to necessarily commit to a third-party like plugin or another tool to kind of manage things. There's definitely value to having tokens working within the like native tools that you're kind of using day to day, particularly if you want to see changes happening live. So I think there's been a lot of like inertia about kind of adopting stuff until people see where things are going. So I think that's been a big question. And I think naming as well around tokens has been a big sticking point for a lot of people. Naming is hard. It feels like you have to commit to something really early, and a lot of teams I've been speaking to over the past have really just been trying to take ideas from people who've got it figured out. And I think that's really helping now that more teams are kind of out there like showing like what they've done and how they've kind of architected things. Like smaller teams, newer teams can kind of start to crib from the best. So.
Rob, I feel like you have brought up something that seems to be the million-dollar question in terms of Figma variables. Now that Figma variables have been announced and they're out there, people are talking about them, what impact does that have on design systems? Does it solve all of the questions that we had about architecture? Are there still questions that are out there? Is this the answer to our prayers? Tell me more about it.
The simple answer is no, it's not the answer to all our prayers. I think it's been quite interesting seeing the reaction in the community to variables. I think there was a lot of anticipation for what Figma were going to do around tokens. We'd heard rumblings of that they were working on something. We had seen that they were making some noise about adopting the W3C community specification. I know that they have been quite forward in sort of proposing a way of doing theming via modes, which is a very contentious topic at the moment. I know Token Studio as well have a sort of counter proposal to that. And it'll be interesting to see which way things go. But I think that anticipation has led to a little bit of frustration and disappointment with what they have actually brought out. Kind of understandable from, we've been building our own sort of approach to tokens at zeroheight as well. And it's such a big topic to cover that you do kind of have to make some hard decisions about like what do you and don't you support out the gate. The fact that they have decided to support more simplistic token types to begin with, things like color, things like dimension. They're not doing things like typography or like border effects and things like that yet. That is all coming, but it's not in place at the moment. And also at the moment, they're not referring to them as tokens. And I think rightly so, because the portability of design tokens, which I think is like the key thing, right? Like the idea of creating a way of encapsulating design decisions through data that can then be used by your designers, by your engineering teams, regardless of platform. Like that's the value of what tokens are going to offer. And variables don't really offer that right now. Like as far as I'm aware, like the two main ways of getting stuff out are either through the REST API, which is locked to enterprise tiers only, or by using like an actual plugin within the product to then do some conversion. And there have been some really neat things that have kind of come out of that, but I haven't seen anything yet that has really taken the Figma variables through that kind of full workflow of like, okay, I as a designer can create some variables, I can convert those into a format that my engineering team can actually use and have that pipeline actually operate. And I think that is like the really big missing point at the moment. And I hope that they can get there because I think Figma have the biggest potential to actually seed tokens through like the design community. And I think from chatting to teams, like tokens do feel like they've been a bit more driven by the engineering side, by the kind of design technologist side, and actually speaking to a lot of more traditional product designers that come from more kind of UX or even UI backgrounds, still aren't kind of completely up to speed on where these things kind of sit. And I think, again, you see that in how even things like the community spec, which I think is great, is very engineering and schema led. And I think as someone who is not technically minded, it can be quite difficult to then get into that. And I think that could be the potential for Figma, but I don't think they're quite there yet, which is disappointing. But I think that's also partly because we built up a lot of expectations around this. Maybe they should have released something a little bit sooner when people first started making noise about it.
Maybe so. Rosie, I'm curious to hear your perspective when it comes to Figma variables and how that relates to the entire tokens infrastructure. I think Rob brought up a really interesting point in terms of where tokens have traditionally sat with UX designers or with engineers. Do you have a different perspective on Figma variables? Are you in the same space? Like how do you interpret that as a product engineer actually building a design system?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I probably have a more harsh angle than Rob does, in that I think they're very good for designers because they're very embedded in Figma. I think they're arguably even worse for developers because there's the expectation that you've got not tokens but variables. So cool, great, I can now communicate much better with my designer about, you want me to use this color of pink, cool, I just reference the same thing and the color pink is there. But that's like not at all possible, as Rob sort of said, unless we pay for an enterprise plan. There's no way that myself, the developer, can link the tokens up. So unless I'm manually making sure that Rob creates a token, I create it in our code base, we essentially haven't moved forward at all from where we were with Figma styles. And Figma styles does actually, there is an open API that as a base level Figma user, I can actually get access to the styles, including the name and the value, which is then easier for me to use as a token than their new variables. So for me, I don't think it's at all a step forward for the whole full flow from Figma into code. I think if anything, it kind of creates this weird blocker of now designers feel like they have tokens and developers are now going to have to make sure that the tokens that we may or may not currently have in the code base align with what the designers see as tokens without any automation, and instead it relies on like two humans communicating, which usually doesn't vibe very well.
That's why there's dev mode.
Well, don't get me started on dev mode.
I was just about to like leap in on that because it's like this is a sidebar, but like it was like kind of fascinating to me when they introduced dev mode and they talked about like that handoff process, and it is something I've heard from like speaking to other like teams around the kind of design dev side. Like I have been very fortunate throughout most of my career to work in places where I work very closely with engineers and get to have more of a back and forth and more like collaboration around stuff, and not have this kind of feeling that I'm like kicking a design over the fence and being like, right, I've done my bit, now you do your bit. But it is kind of interesting that I think that unfortunately, I guess, we are still in a place where, design and development are very siloed. And I think to the point you're making there, Rosie, like the way that variables is kind of built doesn't help break out of those silos. And I think dev mode is also maybe, it's an interesting thing. I think it's acknowledging that there is this issue, but how much that will kind of fix that issue versus creating new ways to not have to communicate, by being able to flag something as ready for dev. So I don't need to like point you to the right thing or have a conversation about something. I can just set a flag and you can go find it. And it will flag up all the changes and stuff for you. Neat, but does it kind of remove that element of collaboration that can actually spring forth a lot of like really, really great ideas and new ways of thinking about stuff?
Yeah, I think the big thing is like, I think Figma has really changed the way product designers design, which has been really great. And I think we've put a lot of stock into new features that they're going to create, thinking that it will also revolutionize quite a bit. But I think at the end of the day, we have to remember, like, the tools aren't going to do the job for us. They're just going to help build efficiencies. So maybe we don't have to manually make tokens because we can use variables now, and it's a lot easier to do like the theming versus having to manually really build that in Figma. But the same thing with dev mode is that it's not supposed to, we shouldn't think that it's going to like really like change things and fix things for us. That is just a way to, like we should still talk to each other and then use the dev mode as like a reference point. But I think sometimes we lean too into, oh, it's going to solve all my problems. But it's really just to help build efficiencies in our day to day.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I think my bigger issue with dev mode is assuming that you are a designer or a developer, and obviously there are lots of roles that line in the middle where you do a bit of both, especially when it comes to design systems. I think there's lots of people who have roles that are very much sort of 50-50, and I think there's useful features on both sides that would be really nice if you could use them both without having to toggle modes all the time. Because yeah, I really love sort of like clicking through a component and being able to switch variables out quite nicely. But it'd just be nice if it was all squished together a bit sometimes.
Totally. We have a question from Dimitri around naming conventions. Does it have to be identical for design and code, or is it adequate to follow different conventions as long as they are matched in the documentation? Michelle, maybe we'll start with you as someone who I think generally has some pretty big opinions about naming conventions.
Yes, so I think like, and I'd be interested to hear Rosie and Rob's take as people who work together. So I used to work on a design system team where we had some designers who were like really into tokens, and they like worked really hard on this like naming convention and the structure. And then they're like, okay, like they spent a lot of time on it, and then they went to share it with the developers they're working with. And the developers already had this like naming convention in place, and it basically like wrecked all the work that the designers had done, because it wasn't going to jive with how things were implemented in code. So I think the biggest takeaway is that you should keep things aligned, work with engineers as early as possible. And then when they have the same naming convention, it's easier to reference. Like you're not having to do that like cognitive load of translating in your brain of like, okay, we say this in design, but in engineering it means this. Like everyone can be on the same page. So that's kind of my experience, my trauma. So
Yeah, no, I fully agree with that. I think it's one of the slight issues we have internally at the moment is we have some sense of alignment, but then there's just like the random certain colors here and there that are named completely differently, and then I can't look at Figma and try and work out why it was named that. I'm trying to talk to Rob about it. Rob's like, don't know what that color is, and it's all a bit confusing. And I do think that's where good old tokens come into play. Because if you can store it, have your source of truth as like a JSON file, the names are fixed there. They could hopefully eventually be pulled into Figma, so then you're using the same things in Figma. We can then use style dictionary and then use it in whatever language we are in the code base. And I think it just makes conversations easier. Like I don't think it's not a must necessarily, but I do think it really improves the flow of communication and just makes everyone's life a little bit easier. And I think if you are going to do different naming, at least make sure that your naming is consistent in both Figma and in the code. So then it's much easier to translate across rather than sort of ending up in a halfway point where everybody's just going out to the Wild West and naming it whatever they want. Yeah, I don't know if you think the same, Rob.
Yeah, I definitely do. I think like for me, that's kind of the point of like if you're adopting design tokens, I think you need to adopt that mentality of having alignment across. Like if you're not doing that, I think you're really losing a big part of what makes design tokens valuable. Otherwise, they are just working for the engineering team or just working for the design team. And I think you can get around some of this stuff. Like obviously, when you get into platform specifics, like if you're thinking about when they get transformed into CSS variables or transformed back into, say, styles or variables within Figma, you can have variances in terms of just like how things are structured. But that's more in terms of like, are you separating by slashes, dashes, or dots? I think that is where really kind of like you can have sort of specific differences. Because I think otherwise that you get back into that old problem that I've definitely had in my career, which is like design defines something one way and will then refer to that by its sort of generic name. Like at a previous company, we had a sort of very specific sort of neon blue that we used in a lot of places. And so we just referred to it as, brand blue. And that was great. But we never fully clarified like what that meant in other places. Like it was a neon color, so it wasn't great for print. So when our marketing team were talking about brand blue, it was a very different color. And when our dev team were then being asked to implement something in brand blue, especially our dev team working on the website as well as the sort of web application flows, they just didn't know what color they were supposed to be using at all. And like that is part of, again, I think why design tokens isn't just about the actual like deliverable, like the end kind of like, oh, here's your JSON file. It's about the process and the methodology that sits around it. It's about not kind of go like starting with like designers or developers going, okay, here's our structure, and everyone else just has to fall in line. It's about kind of opening it up and inviting opinions and collaboration around this stuff. And obviously it shouldn't be designed by committee, but I think for me at least, like part of what I think is super valuable about design systems is trying to bring designers and engineers together, and anyone else who might be involved in that process, whether that's content designers, whether that's UX researchers, whether that's PMs, bringing like the right people into the process and getting agreement and alignment, so you can then just stop having conversations around stuff that really should be sort of second nature to everyone else.
That's a really good point. It feels like for the past 10 minutes or so, we've been talking about ways in which tools have been able to facilitate really effective communication between all members of the product team and places where perhaps tools have fallen a bit short. I guess I'm going to like turn it back on us as folks who are creating a tool that is used by designers, developers, PMs, and the lot. What type of consideration do we have here at zeroheight in terms of how to best do that? Rosie, maybe I'll start with you as someone who has been a staunch sort of critic of dev mode. You can talk about how you've done it much better.
Oh, bold to say we've done it much better. I think we've definitely tried. I think it's a really hard topic to tackle, which is why I'm not judging Figma too much for what they've done. I think trying to get one product to satisfy multiple people is very difficult. And one of the things I found most scary when I joined zeroheight is that the customers we have, the users, are designers and developers who are probably some of the most critical people out there. And so everything you do, you want it to be beautiful, because you're going to have designers look at it. They're going to notice if that padding is slightly off. You want it to work well and quickly, because developers are very impatient people and want things just to work. So that's definitely been interesting in terms of like turning it towards different audiences. We've definitely tried to discover what we can do by almost making our, like, by looking at how we've made our own design system. It's sort of just at the beginning of it, but I think Rob and I, starting from scratch, trying to work out how you make a design system from scratch anymore, what parts are needed, how do you communicate that with a team, is definitely starting to show the things that maybe we're missing in zeroheight that could be added in to make that easier. We've done a lot of focus on developer specific stuff, and actually how do we go from, we're quite good at getting things from Figma into the documentation, and then we've definitely been working on like how do we get that back out, like recently looking at how we've got Figma styles, which technically now outdated now that variables are about, but Figma styles into zeroheight and then back out into a JSON form. So actually we're trying to complete that pipeline that at the moment Figma isn't quite able to. And I think trying to find more ways to do that will be important for getting documentation to be really sort of useful to everybody that's like part of it, rather than just sort of as a quick thing that you reference and then maybe forget about and don't come back to.
Any thoughts there, Michelle? I know you sit a little bit outside of actually creating the product, but what's it like even to talk to customers and organizations who are trying to bridge that gap between designers and developers and are using zeroheight to be able to do that?
Yeah, I think like, and that's kind of one of the reasons why I joined zeroheight, is that I actually really liked the product and was using it before. So when this position opened up, it just seemed really like fun. I think the thing is, like, as a product designer, you're working on products that maybe you use, but maybe you don't. And like if you're on an enterprise product and your main audience is IT admins versus like people who use TikTok, right? Like I think what's nice about working on a tool that's built for product teams is that it's like you're helping out your people. And it's cool to see. It's cool to see like all the features that Rosie and Rob and the rest of our product team work on to really help build that experience and make it better for our tribe. I think it does, there's a balance, right? Like I think it's like there is pressure because we know how picky we are as a tribe, but that we're also serving the tribe too. So it's a fun balance, and I think that's what's really nice is that like I feel like we're making an impact to people who are our people, that and have struggles. So definitely a lot of empathy there.
That's an interesting take. I feel like if I were designing a product for me, you have lots of opinions about what you want, about how it ought to work, and all of that. How do we create sort of a way to make sure that we're designing based off of our own experience and what we know elevates design systems? And then we're also bringing in the perspective of different organizations who might have challenges beyond our own, like maybe organizations that are thinking about multiple brands or have lots of different themes. I'm curious, Rob, maybe if you have a take there as somebody who leads lots of UX research here.
Yeah, I think I have a slightly different view on that, which is I try not to design for myself as much as possible. It's like the most challenging thing about this role compared to previous ones, because I think going like my last job, I was working on like a database product for like visual effects studios, not the end user. So obviously have to rely on research. Here, the challenge for me is like taking a step back and saying, hold on, yes, I'm the designer, but I'm not someone who is working full time on the design system like every day. I'm not working on a design system that has to support multiple different brands, multiple different products. We currently don't offer like light theming or dark theming in zeroheight. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that like is not something I actually have experience with. And so for me, it's a constant reminder that actually like I need to make sure I'm always going to research, to thinking about testing, keeping up to speed on what the rest of the community is saying. And like one of the things I love about working at zeroheight is like the community around this, not just zeros, but also like the wider community of like folks who are sharing like how they're changing things. Like I was just recently reading around like Shopify and the kind of update they've just released for Polaris. Like really interesting to see how they kind of shipped that so quickly, and how the work they've been doing on the design system and building out the right processes has kind of enabled that. So for me, like a lot of time it is trying to not think about how I would approach things, but look at like where have other people kind of like solved this? What are the other challenges that are out there? And I think using that more to inform, what challenges I think we should be tackling, and then also kind of like as to Michelle's point, building out that empathy for the end user. So I think for me it's like slightly different in that I try not to think about how I would do it initially. Hopefully that answers that question.
I think it does. That's a really, really good point. I think we've spent some time thinking a little bit about folks who are building design systems. But Jenny has a really good question that I think is probably just as important and something that we should think about in the building phase as well. What trends have y'all seen working in design system adoption? Any advice on how to get teams on the same page and make sure that folks are actually using the design system? Michelle, let's start with you. I know that that's something that you spent a lot of time thinking about and helping teams plan for at the beginning of creating a design system.
Yeah, I think, adoption is a common thing that people struggle with. And like more and more of teams are really trying to figure out what's next. Because I think if you think about it, atomic design is like 10 years old, and we were all focused on building components either as UI kits in design tools or in code libraries. And then it's like, okay, we have these figured out now. And like now we need to get people to use them. And then I think the big thing is design system teams don't initially realize that a lot of their job is change management. So changing behaviors around getting people to change their day-to-day workflow when they might feel like, hey, I've done this the same way for years and it seemed to work. Like, why do I need to change? Or just change is hard in general. Like, throughout the 3 years, we've had to endure a lot of random change that we had no control over. So like, even if we know changing toward a design system and adapting it is for the better, it's just like we're all a little change fatigued. Um, so we definitely recommend like really finding ways to share the design system and make it part of like people's everyday workflows, like integrating it in there, sharing out. We have an article that I'll put a link to in terms of like ways you can share and just like make it a welcoming, positive environment. So to ease the change a little bit. I think at Config, there was also a YouTube video around one of the companies. They created like a onboarding plan for their design system, which kind of showed people, how to use their tools, where to go for things, and kind of have like a playground and a space to learn. And I think that's really important. Is like, it's not just about getting the components and the documentation done, but really, training people and shepherding that change in a safe way. And in a way that they can grow rather than having them like spend their evenings and weekends trying to catch up on things. Um, so that's definitely like what I think is like next on the horizon is like people finding really good ways to increase that adoption. But I sent
I think
an article on ways you can do that. But yeah, go ahead, Rosie.
no, yeah, that's great. I think all of that like makes real sense, and I think that sort of works on a really high level. I think like diving deeper into how like it maybe works specifically from like a developer angle, and the things that I've found that have worked from sort of trying to get developers to pick up on design systems is sort of like two angles. And I think one of them is allowing contributions more clearly. I often think like design systems that are super shut off and seem like a little black box that nobody can look into, and they just get given these things and told to use them, isn't that interesting to developers. And I think it's not necessarily saying, oh yes, everyone is able to change the code and make the changes, but instead like keeping a real open feedback loop and like acting on it like within a reasonable time frame. Someone says, hey, I really love this text input component, but I have this use case and it doesn't really work for it. Take on that feedback, go back as a design system team, chat about it, work out whether or not that does fit, and if it does, make the change. And people seeing their feedback being taken on board, I think really makes people want to use the design system rather than be something they fear. They'll start to see it as like useful to their day to day. And along with that, the other sort of tangent is flexibility, which isn't often a word used in design systems, but I think is something that people are starting to see where it works, which is that, maybe something looks the same for most use cases, and that's great. But in terms of how you use something technically, we need to allow like flexibility and allow people to take the core item and change it in ways that we're okay with and that are still sort of like understood within the design system, but mean that it's not sort of every time you use something in a slightly different context, you have to go back to the design system team and be like, oh, it doesn't work in this case. Oh, now and it doesn't work in this case. And instead actually give them something that can be quite easily molded into what they need versus being super fixed and being like, no, a text input must always be like 16 by 32 pixels and you can't do anything else with it. It's got to be like that. I think, yeah, making people's life easier definitely increases adoption. And it's hard to find that nice line of like design system has a rules and then also design system needs flexibility so that people can actually use it.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Rob. Sorry.
I was just gonna like piggyback off of that. And I think for a while, like there was this kind of like sort of slogan around design systems of like treat your design system like a product. And I think a lot of people took that to just be like, okay, build a team, have designers, developers, a PM maybe kind of like sort of owning and building this through. But I think it comes back to actually, like, if you're building a product, like, think about what value are you providing. Like, if you're not providing value to the end user, like, they're not going to stick around, they're not going to adopt. It's the exact same challenge with design systems. I think like, if people haven't seen it, Dan Mao's talk, Your Next Component, I think it's Your Next Component, Your First Component. He gave it at Converge last year, and I think also did it at Config recently. Really, really great talk on how you should start and how you can start to prove some of this value. And his kind of the TLDR is like, don't start with the button. Start with something that is painful, that people actually need. Show the value of like why you should work in this way, and begin to kind of like prove it. Because if you can fix problems for people, they are going to become advocates for the approach, and that then makes your job a lot easier, because you can actually focus on building stuff and creating stuff and serving your users, and you don't have to be going out there constantly banging the drum to say, hey, we've got a design system, we've got tokens, like, come and use it. Because that is a lot of work to also do around the kind of actual design systems creation stuff.
Totally. That makes a lot of sense. Alyssa wants to up the ante a little bit. We've been talking about design system adoption in sort of the abstract, but she's wondering if you all have any suggestions for rolling out the first enterprise design system across multiple product areas. Is there anything that's necessary pre-launch, during launch, post-launch? What does that look like? Rosie, maybe we'll start over there.
Oof, this is a tricky one. It's been a while since I've worked anywhere that's sort of enterprise level. So this is definitely stretching my boundaries. But I'd say what's important in terms of, especially from like a developer angle, is having a good hierarchy set up of, presumably you're going to have a set of like base values. Like, I don't want to just talk about tokens, but we're starting there. You'll have a set of base values for your tokens, right? And making sure that the hierarchy of how to build on top of them is super clear, so that, say, for one product you build on it, by just putting one set on top, but then for the other product you end up with like 4 different sets. Don't let that happen too early on. Make sure there's some sense of structure of how a token set grows, how you build that hierarchy, so that then when you look at each product, they all flow the same, so that both as a developer and a designer, when you're looking across them, you don't have to change your understanding of how it all works. It's all about sort of keeping the flow exactly the same. In terms of launching them, I don't think I have any experience, so I might have to hand that over to either Michelle or Rob. I've generally been a lot smaller scale.
Yeah, I'm happy to dive into that. So I think my last company was an enterprise company, and we had like lots of acquisitions, lots of random products, and we're all trying to unify the system, and that just takes a long time in itself. But like trying to get those like little wins was really, it was hard. But I think the approach that I was successful with is that I would start small. So like I would also like kind of share with some teams like what we were doing and give updates, so people felt like included and knew that this change was coming. But also doing a little bit of a pilot. So maybe you find a smaller product, a smaller team, and then just like rolling it out on a smaller scale to see kind of like what feedback you're getting from them, what questions they have, like, because they're going to ask it, how do I create a component, and what's the governance process? Can anyone create a component? Like, they're going to have all these questions, so that way you can get a good sense of like what kind of questions your organization might ask and have answers ready. I think once you actually pilot it for however long, like a month or, a quarter, or however long, being able to share that as like a case study, like a success story. So then later on you can go and, like scale the like usage of the design system across more teams. You can say like, this is how, the mobile app team did it. And you can talk to them about any hiccups. So like maybe engineers might feel more comfortable talking to other engineers, and other designers talking more to other designers, just to kind of see how they navigated implementing it. And it kind of builds momentum that way. So that way it doesn't have to be this like all or nothing rollout, because I think that can be very jarring. It can also like put a lot of pressure, and also like if you mess up, like that's gonna really like, I guess, make people skeptical of changes, right? So I really like the idea of like piloting, so you can kind of like work out all those like hiccups early on.
Totally. So let's say that a team follows advice from both Michelle and Rosie, and they have an incredibly successful rollout at their enterprise company. Then we arrive at the question from Dimitri, which is, how do you measure the success of that design system? Is there anything beyond the obvious metrics like adoption and the number of detaches? Perhaps we'll throw it over to Rob to start.
Yeah, I was gonna jump in on this, mainly because I think like measuring is, I think, also like a real hot topic. Like I don't think many people have figured it out. There are tools that are starting to appear that can help with some of this stuff a little bit. I know Omelette, which I think is from the like a spin-off off of Zeppelin. They offer some ways of like tracking through kind of code components and things like that, and that is like super useful. Figma on some of their higher paid tiers offer kind of like component analytics as well. So those kind of things are useful. I think like for me, like again, I come back to thinking about how do we run the product, and it's thinking about like what does success actually look like? Is it about, you know, what level of code coverage you have? Like, is that the right indicator, or is it actually a more nebulous metric of like how much quicker you can ship things, or the number of defects you're finding in the product, or you know, some teams that I've been speaking to, like part of the reason why they've been building out the design system is to improve accessibility, you know, by bringing some of those accessibility challenges into the design system components, raising that base level of standard. So maybe actually the success metric isn't around adoption, it's about, are you passing those accessibility checks now? And I think really like for me, like that's the core thing. What is the design system trying to solve, like at this point in time, and what are the ways that you can measure that? Adoption is one of those things, and there are ways to do that, again, like through Omelette or through just kind of like looking at, say, pull requests from the like, you know, component packages that you're kind of shipping out there and stuff. So yeah, that's kind of a bit of a nebulous answer, I guess, but yeah, start with what does success actually look like, and I think your metrics will then start to come from that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's the thing is like, yeah, like Rob hit the nail on the head, is like really understanding like what problem the design system's trying to solve. And Jared Spool has like an article on like UX outcomes, where you think about what the experience outcome is, and then you go find the data that will support it, versus taking all the data tools that you might have available to you and then coming up with some like metric goal or KPI from the data tools that you have, because that might not be the right thing, because it does really depend, it could be for accessibility, or just consistency, or across the product portfolio, and it really does depend. So yeah, for sure, great question and great answer, Rod.
Awesome. We have a question over from C, who is having a challenge trying to hire the right fit for their design system team. Do y'all have any recommendations for skills, both hard and soft, that design systems particularly require that might be a little bit different from hiring for different roles? Michelle, I know you just spoke, but you have some experience hiring for design systems teams. So maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that like, rounding out like a design system team like has to take into consideration. So some of the factors I look for are, being able to think broadly. So because you're thinking of like, have like a really good systems thinking of like how something will scale across, but also have like having detail-oriented thinking to be able to design those components. And it's not to say that one person has to have all these skills. I think when I built my team, it's like we made sure there was a balance of everything. So we had someone that was a design technologist, so they were like a design engineer. So they had a technical background to be able to like help us think what we needed to do to help with to help engineering. We had someone that was good with accessibility, people that were familiar with mobile, web, whatever our products were including, and then just different languages as well, like spoken languages, not coding languages. So thinking about that, but I think also the mindset is, you know, the soft skill aspect is like being really good about collaborating. There's a lot of collaboration, being able to like liaise with other people. So championing the design system, collaborating with engineers, getting out of their comfort zone, because this is somewhat a different challenge. So I think that's kind of like what some of the things I was looking for when building out a team. And I think, yeah, it's not to say that one person has to have all those skills, but like it's nice to be able to have like a wide variety and then have people learn from each other, as a way to like up level their skill set as well.
Totally. That makes a lot of sense. I want to make sure that we get an opportunity to answer Alyssa's question as well. What are y'all's thoughts on building an in house repository for the design system versus leveraging open source libraries like MUI? Pros and cons to both? If so, what are those? Rob, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, like Rosie might be a little bit better from like the sort of code side, but I think for me, I'll give the typical designer answer of it depends. And yeah, I think like a lot of these tools can be super useful if you're trying to just get something off the ground and you want to have a really good, solid foundation that you can kind of build on top of. And I think like Material UI can be like great for that. And I think if we want to get something out there that like relatively quickly that answers a lot of use cases and you don't have very specific kind of like customization needs around that, then like I think that's a great option. But I think what a lot of people find is that as you start to then need to branch off of Material UI a lot more, and as you want to maybe have a bit more ownership over what kind of components you're building, how you're kind of treating them, that does lead teams to shift away. And in fact, quite recently I was doing some research with a team that had kind of built off of Material to begin with, and we're now sort of looking to sort of shift away a little bit because they've been having those sort of challenges. And that's not to say they made the wrong decision, like they made the right decision at the time, but I think it's like these things are always constantly in flux. Like we're seeing the same thing ourselves in that we're kind of rebuilding our design system because what previously existed was built a few years ago, and we've now got a new team, we have new requirements. So it's always kind of assessing like what is actually the value we're trying to get out of that. And I think, you know, for me, that's the really big thing to consider. So I think if you're looking for speed and not necessarily like in-depth customization, then maybe something that is a bit more open source like works really well and is going to give you a lot of coverage like out of the gate. But if you want to build something that's super bespoke, that is long term going to really serve you, then I think like investing that time and that effort is super valuable if you have that time available to you right now, because you know that's the nature of the world we kind of are working in. You know, like we have deadlines, we have time pressures to deal with, so there are just a multitude of factors to kind of consider. So unfortunately it's not a simple yeah, it's all good, go for it. That's at least my take.
Rosie, anything to add there as our resident product engineer?
No, I don't think so. I think it was a relatively similar answer. I think, it's basically a question of speed. I've definitely, sort of in personal projects, it's just the way to go because you have something that's quite accessible as long as you pick the right set of core elements to go off of. You can change the code quite easily to change things like colors. It can then be used. If you do want to sort of like package it up and serve it as an npm package, you've actually got a lot of sort of the base structures built for you, so you don't have to go through that faff. And it can be quite a nice place to start. So I think if you're a small business and you're just looking to get something up and running, it's probably a great shout. If it's a personal project, I'd say almost definitely. But I'd say, yeah, if you have a longer period of time and you have a designer that is going to be able to commit themselves to doing it, then I do think there are a lot of benefits to starting your own thing from scratch and maybe running it alongside some sort of pre-set up package, but trying to put much more effort into quickly getting going on your own. So yeah, I'd say it's very project dependent.
Totally. I think we have time for one more question. And in case you have burning questions, feel free to throw them in chat, or better yet, throw them over into Zeros, where we can continue the conversation for days and get the perspective of lots of different folks. But the last question that we'll ask of our panel is, based on current trends and what you've noticed, what advice would you give to people who are starting a design system? Michelle, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think the thing is with the design system field is that like trends will continue to evolve, some faster than others, but like being flexible, I think, not necessarily like waiting until the dust settles, because the dust will never settle. And then trying things out, knowing that, you might be trying things out that suit your team at this moment in time, but that things might evolve. So kind of like what Rob said in terms of like if you use MUI, maybe that was that wasn't the wrong decision, but like that was the decision for the time being, but then you evolve later on. So being flexible to evolve and know that that's okay. I think the other thing is like definitely talking to other design system makers. So like on Zeros, just asking what they've been through, because I think there's a lot of advice that people can give, so you can skip some of the trauma that we've all endured.
Rob, what say you as somebody who's starting a design system right now?
Yeah, I think like that last point Michelle made around like, there are a lot of people who have been through this, and what's great about the community is so many people are willing to share what they have done, how they've done it, and there's so much that you can learn from, really great kind of like people on Zeros, obviously, but also like through Medium blogs, through other design blogs. Like there is just so much out there. The one thing I would add to that though is it is really easy to then want to try to do everything. It is really easy to be like, oh, well, we should make sure we fully tokenize our design system and we can support different themes. And we have a really robust component library that is delivered through an NPM package. And our documentation is like really well written and has rich kind of like interactive previews. Like it's so tempting to do that. Particularly, I think like this is a trap that we fell into ourselves, like because we speak to all kinds of companies and we see like all the different things people are trying to do. And I think really what I would say is like come back to that core element of like what are the problems you're trying to solve, and keep it focused. Think about how you can get to sort of proving value as quickly as you can in the right way. And some of these things you'll have to make decisions along the way, and it's okay to go back on a decision. Like it is an iterative process, as Michelle was saying. So just kind of accept that and go with it. And I think you'll be fine.
And Rosie, do you want to take us home?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me is including people, which kind of touched on the point of reaching out to others, but I think make sure that within your own team, your own company, everybody that's going to be a part of it, which realistically is literally everybody at the company, make sure that everyone knows what's happening, like communicate really openly, keep people up to date with what's happening, and be really open to feedback and making changes based off that. Don't just ask for feedback and throw it away. Prove that you're there to make something for everyone. So yeah, keep the communication channels open, involve everybody, and that's sort of the best way to guarantee that you'll have something that will flow, that isn't just going to be a designer's dream or a developer's dream, and instead will hopefully keep everybody happy.
Totally. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining. Really excited that we got an opportunity to have a conversation about hot takes on design system trends. Remember, we'll be back next Tuesday for another webinar. And you will also receive an email with the recording as well as links to some of the things that we have referenced during our time here. See you all over in Zeros, and thanks again for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.